Hey Creative, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to hop into my design process for creating an action movie poster. Now, I love action movies, but I wanted to try something a little bit different. And I was inspired by this image I came across on Pexels that had a little bit of a Western vibe to it. And hey, if you're new here, I'm Eric, a brand and key art designer with 15 years of design experience, and I create videos to show you what it's like to be a graphic designer in entertainment. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you, number one, how to use AI to help you generate titles and synopsises for your poster designs. Number two, how to compose images together to help you tell the story that you want. Number three, making your key art stand out by using contrast to draw the viewer's attention where you want. Number four, adding realism to your images by using custom brushes that will help you add mood and atmosphere. And number five, how to use Adobe Photoshop's new generative fill feature to make your life easier and save you loads of time. So let's jump right into it. To get started, I went over to Chat-GPT and asked it to help me come up with a list of titles and names. And it gave me a pretty good list. And from here, I just kind of picked out some different keywords that I liked and came up with Alone in the Flames. But I also used Chat-GPT to help me put together a synopsis so I had a jumping off point for the story. And it gave me quite a bit of text here, but I just grabbed this snippet that said, "Consumed by grief and driven by an insatiable thirst for revenge, our female character embarks on a perilous journey determined to bring those responsible for justice." Not bad. So for this poster, I really want to showcase a strong and resilient heroine character who's looking for revenge after her family dies in a mysterious plane crash. And I'm using some other posters for inspiration here that I looked at, like Jonah Hex, Blacklight, and Longmire, that all kind of have that cool Western vibe that I'm going for. Now, I just want to clarify that I'm not using AI to help me generate images or designs. If this were a real-world project, the client would most likely be providing me with a title, a brief, a synopsis or a plot, and probably other assets too. But for the demonstration purposes of this tutorial, I'm using Chat-GPT as my client. So at this point, I'm ready to jump into Photoshop and I'm setting up my 11 by 17 document and importing my first image, which is going to serve as the environment or background. Now, because this image is short, the first thing I'm going to do here is get it in position, make a selection, and use the generative fill to fill in that sky on top of the image. So this would normally take quite a long time if I were just clone stamping a sky and trying to fill it in. But with the generative fill here, it not only gives you one option, it gives you 3 different variations to choose from. So it takes something that would take 10 minutes and makes it like a 30-second job. Now, once I have that in there, I'm going to import this car image and try to isolate those hills in the distance so that I can put it behind the flames. Now, again, remember, this is sort of taking place in the wilderness here. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And we want to try to get that feeling from the environment. By showing these hills, these mountains in the distance, and blending it together with that sort of fiery landscape, it really starts to create a certain mood here that we're going for. But I'm not going to stop there. I'm also going to apply some levels adjustments and actually use the red and blue and green channels independently with the levels to have some control over the color. And I want to try to create this sort of eerie nighttime sepia tone effect. And I'll also throw a curves adjustment layer on there as well, just to get more contrast out of it and enhance it a little bit more. But you can see that it's starting to come together and look a little bit sort of smoky, kind of like how New York was looking a few weeks ago. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and keep adding on some more images here by bringing in my plane. Now remember, our main character lost her family in this plane crash, which is pretty awful. But I'm going to blend this plane in here with the background, with the flames. We want to try to have that captured moment from the story. And that's why I'm using these images, because we're trying to pick out the most important aspects of our story and try to capture that moment in the poster. And remember, with key art, with posters, you only really have that single image to tell a story. It's not like you're showing a video and you've got, 10 seconds or 30 seconds to do it. So it's really important to try and incorporate those key elements of a story here. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is, of course, add my main character here. So I'm bringing in this image of the woman. This is the image I showed you in the beginning that had that kind of like cowboy vibe to it. And I need to create a silhouette here. So I'm doing that using some of Photoshop's built-in AI tools to get that nice selection, and then just refining it manually with brushes and the pen tool. Now I'm going to come back to this a little bit later because you can see that the lighting is quite different here. So I need to shift everything from those cool blue tones to a warmer, fiery kind of vibe, right? And the first things I'm doing is just sharpening up the images, adding some contrast to try and composite it and blend it in a little bit into the background. But that contrast is going to make her stand out from the background. And that's what we want to focus on here. I always try to have like a very distinctive foreground, middle ground, and background when doing stuff like these. So once that starts to get established a little bit more, I can then concentrate on the overall composition and how everything's fitting together. Now this took a little bit of time to figure out what combination of adjustment layers I needed to use to change the coloring here, but I know that I used some color lookup layers, some hue saturation layers, levels, a couple of different ways, just to shift all of those hues and tones over where I wanted them to be, right? And once I have this in place, again, it will allow me to continue adding on and building out this composition. And this was a little bit tricky too, because you can see there's some weird highlights on the hat. There's some stuff going on with the hair, all things that I need to take care of throughout the course of this design. And as I was building this, I also started to think, it'd be cool if I added some lighting on top and behind my subject to make her feel more immersed in this world. And to do that, I just used a large soft round brush. I selected some orange yellow, and I just kind of painted on top of my subject, which was all contained inside of a group folder that had a layer mask on it. And this layer mask ensures that all of that lighting is being confined to our main subject or our main character here. Now, I also like to go in and do some kind of like edge lighting and rim lighting sometimes, just to try and get certain edges to pop out a little bit. But again, this is something that can be a little bit tricky sometimes, so you just want to remember that you can always use a layer mask to kind of hide it or reveal it in certain spots. The last thing you want is a halo going around your entire image, right? So just be mindful of that and try to keep it isolated to just a few different spots. Now, I'm continuing to use my brush, as you can see here, while I work on the hair to try and paint in some shadows, because I really want to try to blend the hat and the hair in a little bit more so it doesn't stand out so much. At the moment, the light is kind of coming from the background, right? So it's not really coming from underneath or directly behind her like in the original image. There's some space there, and I want to try to get that feeling right. All right, and here I'm just using different blending modes, brushing on some more light to the front to get that light wrap effect that makes it more convincing when you're bringing all these images together, right? And that's the trick that I like to use sometimes in posters, is putting that nice light on top of the subject and have some of it kind of overlap with the background, because it makes everything feel really unified and cohesive. Okay, so you'll see I'm just working here and now putting in some shadows, right? I spent quite a bit of time working on the lights, but here I'm going back with a dark brush and starting to add some shadows so that I can push some of those things back a little bit. Like I said, you don't want everything to be standing out equally. When you're working with contrast, it's about picking those few strategic places or areas that you want to jump out and grab the viewer's attention. And in this case, I'm trying to do that on the subject's face, on her hands that are kind of, clasped over her chest there, and just trying to draw the attention to that area as well as the background. Now, obviously, I did speed this up a little bit, but when you're working like this, it's really nice because it's totally non-destructive. Anytime you're working with brushes, adjustment layers, and smart objects, those are some really important things to keep in mind when you're building up compositions like this, because they always allow you to go back and make changes if you need to. All right, so as I was building this up, you'll see me going back to the same subject group folder here again and again, because I kept experimenting and playing around with trying to find that balance, right? You want to find that balance with the lightness, the shadows, all of that stuff as you're working here. And I'm still going to go back again and change this a little bit later, but it's really about building up things gradually. And you guys know, you've seen some of my videos, but if you haven't seen some of those videos where I create other posters, you'll know that I'm pretty organized with my layers. And this is why. Because at this point, I've probably got 15 layers just on my subject, right? And it's really easy to lose track when you're working this way. So I definitely want to encourage you to try to name your layers and keep track of them as much as you can, because that is definitely a good practice that I try to use. All right. And again, like I said at the beginning, if this were a real project, you would probably have, maybe some gallery shots that were shot on like a green screen or some kind of backdrop. You wouldn't necessarily have your subject like this one, who was shot in such a different kind of environment with that really strong neon lighting behind her. So that was a challenge with this one, but I think that's part of the thing to keep in mind too, is when you're grabbing images like this, you're going to have to do some work to them to try and blend them with the environment that you're putting them into. All right, so here I'm adding that backlight behind the subject, and you can't have a Western poster without some fire and some sparks, right? So here we go. Here's the sparks. And this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about when it comes to adding atmosphere, when it comes to adding realism to your images. All right, these are the kind of things that will help take it to that next level. And sometimes I'll do it with photographic textures like the sparks that you're seeing here. But I'm also going to go ahead and use some custom Photoshop brushes, which I picked up from Envato. Now, I've used some of these brushes before in some of my previous movie tutorials or movie poster tutorials. But here, what I'm looking to do is incorporate some fog, some smoke, right? We just saw a plane crash in the background. So obviously, where there's fire, there's going to be smoke. So that's exactly what I'm adding here. I'm putting that smoke in. And what I want to do is then play around with the color, the hue, the tone to make it fit into this world, right? So you can see there's a lot of brushes in this pack. So I was experimenting with some different brushes for a while and trying to find the right ones. But once I did find one I like, I blew it up and I just kind of painted it over the entire background behind the subject. And again, that's contrast too, because you have now your subject standing out even more when you're placing something a little bit lighter like this behind her. All right, so here you'll see me using some adjustment layers just to change the color of that smoke a little bit. And this is adding the atmosphere, this is adding the realism, and this is pumping up the contrast. And by doing this, it's really kind of immersing us in this scene, right? And all of those kind of key elements of the story here with our main character, the plane crash, the isolation, right? And she looks like she's ready to go out and handle some business. So I'm going to keep adding to this by putting some more atmosphere and some more smoke in front of the subject. Because just like I talked about a little bit before, a few minutes ago, I was saying you want to have a key foreground, middle ground, and background. And to help you kind of tie those things together, you can use stuff like this, right? You can use brushes to kind of make things feel really more connected and cohesive, right? And sometimes I'll duplicate the brushes a few times, play around with the colors, play around with the blending modes. I usually use screen blending modes when I'm applying things like that, especially with, sparks, smoke, rain, snow, any kind of like element. I find that screen blending mode works particularly well. So at this point, I've added that fog in the front, but I don't want it to, take too much away from the subject. So I'm going to have to play around with that a little bit more, just to make sure that as I add my text, everything's nice and readable. But just like I was saying with my other photo textures, I'm bringing in a nice grungy texture here just to add some grit to it. And just like you saw in some of the examples that I used in the beginning, right? The blacklight poster, and the Jonah Hex poster, and, all that kind of stuff. Longmire, like there's a nice gritty feel about them. And I really wanted to try to capture that. And adding a texture on top of your image is a great way to do that. So there's a lot of different tips and tricks that you'll see here, like throughout the course of this video. Again, I'm adding more light on top. I'm using those atmospheric brushes. I'm using textures, all these things together as I composite these images to create this scene. Now, I have some lights on top, which again is really helping to pop out the subject, but it's still a little bit too heavy-handed, right? So I'm going to put a little more grit on top, throw some noise on it like you've seen me do before, and then I'm going back to that talent folder I have and playing around with those shadows and highlights again. Right, and you'll see like where the hat is, it's a little too bright. Where her arms are, it's still a little too bright, but it's not so bad. So what I'm doing is just painting in some shadows on her hat, right? Just to darken those highlights a little bit. And I'm also going over the hair a little bit more to do the same thing. Right, and here I'm going back, I'm cleaning up the silhouette a little bit because it was a little bit of a, messy selection in some areas. And something I like to do when I'm cleaning up the silhouette is I'll use the R key on the keyboard to rotate my whole canvas. And then I'll just use the brush tool and my stylus to kind of go in there and paint over the edges a little bit. And when I zoomed in and I was looking at this, I did notice that there were some blemishes and bumps on the subject's skin. So all I did was go into that main smart object I had, made a duplicate layer, put it on high pass, set to the overlay blending mode, and then I blurred it a little bit, threw a layer mask on it, inverted the layer mask, and painted with white all over the areas that I wanted to soften. So that's a really good trick that I can show you in another video if you haven't seen this before, to soften skin. All right, I do this all the time with retouching. Now at this point, I was feeling pretty good about the composition and where things were headed. So now I wanted to add my title treatment, right? This is where we're going to put in Alone in the Flames. And for the text here, I'm using a typeface called Black River, which is a really awesome font from Heritage Type Co. And I like to use their fonts because they have some great kind of vintage looks to them, which seem perfect for a poster like this. Now I'm going to take it a step further and throw some textures in there. And all I'm doing is using a clipping mask to clip it to my text. And this way I can always go back in, change the size of the font, the tracking, anything like that without messing up the texture. And in addition to that, I'm also going to use some adjustment layers here to play around with the color, right? Again, I want it to feel kind of connected and unified, and we're using a lot of these sepia, brown, orange, and yellow kind of tones to get that gritty Western action movie poster vibe, right? And I'm pretty happy with the way that it's looking now, especially with the title kind of tucked behind the hat a little bit. I think that that helps add a lot of depth and perspective here. But to add the rest of it, I'm going to have to kind of go on both sides of the subject's hat, which you'll see me do here, right? I'm putting some of the text on one side behind her head, and then I'm going to put some of the text or the rest of the title in front, right? And having that overlap just makes it more visually interesting. So what I'm doing here is just exactly that, with the same font, a little bit smaller, maybe a brighter color, again, to have some contrast on the dark, smoky clouds in the background. And then everything is going to feel nice and connected. But we can't have a movie poster without the credit block, right? You got to add those nice details in there. So here I'm using the credit block that I've created and I've shared in some of my previous poster tutorials. But what I'm looking to do is just customize it a little bit, change up some of the text here and there to make it feel more custom for this poster. And of course, throwing in the title, that's a must. Changing up the color, the size, and just really figuring out where that copy's going to live. Now, before I was talking about adding that fog and atmosphere in front of the subject, well, this is where I realized I need to start to actually mask some of that out because you can't really read the credit block that well. So I'm just playing around with that bottom area, again, because of the contrast, and I want the viewer's eye to be able to go there and read some of that copy. Okay, but at this point, it's feeling pretty good. Things are coming together pretty nicely. And it's just about making those refinements, making those tweaks, right? I'd say at this point about like 85% of the design is pretty much good and in place. But there's still some things in particular with the talent, right, or the main subject that I want to focus on. So what I'm doing now is adding some global adjustments, which you've heard me talk about before in some of my videos. And this is just adding those layers at the very top that are going to affect everything beneath it. Right, so I'm doing a couple of color lookup layers here and throwing it into a CC folder. And at that point, what I'll usually do is merge everything together and put it on a smart object at the very top of the layer stack, convert it to a smart object, and use the camera raw filter inside of Photoshop to add those finishing effects. Now, I did do that here, but the thing is, I realized once I kind of set that up a little bit, I wanted to go back and make some more edits and changes because I still wasn't quite happy with the contrast and the way that the hair and the hat were looking. So you'll see me going through the camera raw settings, and then I go back. I actually had to scrap it, just delete that top layer, go back and make the changes I want, and then apply that camera raw setting again, which isn't a big deal because all we're really doing is just merging layers, making it a smart object, and playing with the settings a little bit. So it's okay if you have to go back, take a second look at something, and realize, that there might be some more changes you want to make. I think that's a big part of the game with key art especially, is that there's always going to be some more edits or some more tweaks or something you could do to enhance the design a little bit further, right? And another thing that I went back to change was the position of the texture inside of the title. I know that that's something I wanted to tweak a little bit more, along with the changes that I've made on my subject here. So you'll see I'm adding those shadows, I'm going back in, and now I'm merging all of that together again to put my finishing effects on it once everything is in place. So this is, a condensed version of the poster process that I use when I'm creating key art. And I know that I've covered a lot of things here, but I wanted to show you what that process looks like from start to finish, right? And this is where we ended up, right? So starting with that title, that brief, looking at inspiration, telling the story with our images, and then building this scene together to try and help us tell that story, tell that narrative of our main character who's out here looking for revenge, right? So you saw this, process, and you saw where I was going with the inspiration in the beginning. I was pretty happy with where this ended up. And after making those last couple of edits and tweaks, I think we're in a pretty good spot. So here you'll see me just tidying that up a little bit more, finishing this up with my camera raw smart object layer on the very top, which I'm just going to go back to really quick to get some of those last minute effects here. I'm just looking for that nice balance, right? And you can see that it really does add a lot to the poster. And here's where we ended up with our Alone in the Flames movie poster design. If you're serious about taking your poster and key art designs to the next level, chances are you want to improve your skills. So you'll definitely want to check out this new video from me that describes the 5 secrets you need to create great poster designs. And these are the same things that have helped me get hired by companies like Showtime, Sci-Fi, HGTV, or Major League Baseball. All right, creatives, thank you so much for watching. Keep designing, and we'll see you in the next one.